From the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this is Nebraska Farmcast. I'm Ryan Evans. Incorporating distillers' grains into livestock feed can be an effective way to add weight and other desirable nutrition qualities to an animal's diet. Elliott Dennis, assistant professor and livestock economist with the Center for Ag Profitability, has just published a new article that looks at the impact of low corn stocks to use ratios, as well as the conflict between Russia and Ukraine on the Distillers-to-Corn price ratio. And he joins me now. Hi, Elliott. How are you doing?
I'm doing well today. Thanks, Ryan.
Great. Yeah, thanks for being here again. And can you just start off by explaining how distillers' grains are produced and what their market and appeal is, especially here in Nebraska?
Yeah, so distillers' grains are a co-product of ethanol production. And so we take corn and using a certain milling process, we get basically corn ethanol or fuel ethanol, really. And then we get some carbon dioxide, natural gas, and we get distillers' grains. And distillers' grains are very wet when they come out, and we call it wet distillers' grains. And then the ethanol plant can choose to decide to dry down the distillers' grains to create modified wet distillers, so that has a lower moisture content, or dry down to what we call dry distillers. And that really depends on the cost of electricity, the ability of that plant to do drying. And really, when we look at wet distillers and modified, it can really only be shipped within a certain radius of that plant, generally 100 to 150 miles. But once it's dried down completely to complete dried distillers grain, which is about 10% moisture level, it can be shipped really anywhere. And so we actually ship and export a lot of dry distillers to, Asia, and even into places like Texas. And so the use of distillers really came about, 20, 25 years ago when fuel ethanol production started to come about. And what we've done a lot of studies here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the Department of Animal Science, and what they've really shown is that feeding distillers can be has a lot of benefits for the animal itself. And recently we've tried to take what they've been doing and put it into some economic frameworks to show when is it the most profitable producers to use. And the greatest thing that we always get from, or the comments we generally get, is what is this price ratio between corn and distillers impact in that decision.
And then before we get to more about that, is there more distinction between the different types of distillers' grains that are produced by ethanol plants in terms of the benefits each type might have for the animals?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Department of Animal Science has done a lot of randomized control trials where they basically feed a certain group of animals a typical corn diet, whether that's high moisture, dry rolled corn, or steam flaked corn, and they feed another group of animals basically that corn, high moisture corn, steam flake, dry rolled corn, and then in addition have some sort of inclusion of a type of distillers. And what they've shown is that if you talk to a lot of the animal scientists, they say when we tend to feed wetter products, we tend to have better animal performance. But really, at what level of inclusion should we be at? So if we're feeding wet distillers with yearling cattle with high moisture corn, should we be feeding at 10% inclusion, 20% inclusion, 40% inclusion? And so some work that myself and a couple other collaborators from animal science are really showing is in a couple months that will be released and shows actually what are those economic trade-offs at different inclusion levels. So this paper was kind of a preview to that and really show that pre and during and post-COVID, kind of how that price ratio, which is kind of the driving factor in that decision, have changed over time.
Great. And is there anything that you can say now in terms of how distillers' grain prices, especially relative to corn prices, are being impacted by economic events like the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and then how the prices today are compared to historic prices?
Yeah, so in order to really compare prices, we have to do a couple modifications to the prices that are reported. So we always have to compare these things on a dry matter basis, and we either convert distillers grains to dollars per bushel, or we can convert corn to dollars per ton. And so before we can compare those prices, we had to do that. In the paper, I provide that the data that's provided has already been kind of modified. And so what we see over time is that it's not necessarily the price level of either corn or distillers that's important, but it's the relative difference between the two. That's what we call the price ratio. So in the paper, when that price of distillers is higher than corn, that would indicate that, it's more expensive relative to what both distillers and corn prices are changing. Now, when we think about, when is the highest demand for corn, it tends to be in the summer when people are driving. Fuel ethanol is in high demand, so we tend to want to buy a lot of bushels then and grind a lot of corn. But that's not necessarily the time when we have a lot of cattle, so that demand for that distillers is a lot lower. Now compare that to the opposite. We tend to not have a lot of demand for fuel ethanol in December, but that's when we have a lot of cattle on feed and we need a lot of distillers. So this price ratio tends to vary over time, is both driven by the supply of distillers by ethanol plants and also the demand of that distillers grains by cattle feeding. And this price ratio isn't the same for dry distillers, modified distillers, and wet distillers, just depending upon where we're at in the state. And even if we're looking into other states, it varies both through time and within season.
Great. And as producers weigh including distillers grains in their feeding regimen, do you have any advice on how large of a role that price ratio plays and how that should impact the decision to incorporate them? I know that the research is coming out on this soon, but what's your advice to producers right now and what they can kind of look for to prepare for the next year?
Yeah, so one of the things that we talk about is really sticking with this, with a strategy and being consistent with it through time. And so in the paper, there's this table where we kind of show what is the probability of you paying a higher price ratio by distillers relative to corn, both pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic. And then really what is the price difference if you were to look at between dry distillers and wet distillers, or modified and wet, or dried and wet, and what it would be the probability that you'd pay a higher price ratio for those. And so what we really showed is that wet distillers was the primarily the one that was severely affected. If you look at the figure, it's very drastic. You can see almost that big run up. And some other work that I've done, even though that run up was really high during COVID because people weren't driving, there wasn't a large demand for fuel ethanol, but we still had that demand from cattle producers. It did run up, but it was only that effect was only for about 3 months. And interestingly, when we had this the Ukrainian conflict that was going on, what we noticed was that corn just ran through the roof during the spring and summer. And there was concerns that, this is going to really change a lot of our feeding. But when you actually looked at the price ratio between distillers and corn, it actually was a lot smaller than we really experienced in the last 4 years. And so that's where we kind of really need to, get the data, convert to a dry matter basis, and look at that relative comparison between feeding corn and feeding distillers with some type of either dry rolled, high moisture, or steam flaked corn.
Well, we'll definitely look forward to the release of that full report when the research is ready to come out. You can stay tuned to cap.unl.edu and Nebraska Farmcast for that. And make sure you do check out Dr. Dennis's latest article here on the Distillers-to-Corn price ratio, how this has been impacted. That's on our website, of course, cap.unl.edu. And Elliott, I want to thank you for the time and once again, the great information.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.